So this is Love, a Twisted Tales series. What if Cinderella never tried on the glass slipper? Chapter 24. Ferdinand was most perturbed by what he had witnessed. All this time the maiden with the glass slipper had been her, Cinderella. Ferdinand had thought she looked familiar. What an idiot he'd been to recruit her to spy on Genevieve. Now the girl knew far too much. And if Charles had his way, she would become Princess of Arulas, and then, one day, Queen. The servant becoming a royal, he muttered to himself, hardly able to believe it. This is even worse than I feared. It will doom the kingdom. Displeasure darkening his expression, he twirled his monocle. The prince couldn't possibly marry a servant. The people were already getting ideas. The youth especially no longer had the same respect for rank and breeding. Just yesterday, in the western countryside, there had been a riot against the local lord, a riot Ferdinand had worked hard to conceal from the king. And in the east, a band of young revolutionaries had demanded that the king allow commoners to serve on his council. Imagine! If Charles married Cinderella, who knew what the people might do? Who knew whether the monarchy would survive? Straightening his back, he tidied the folds of his jacket, dusting imaginary dirt off his sleeves out of habit. He was about to return to his duty at the king's side when he stole another glimpse at the prince and his newfound bride. They were still talking, their heads bent close like a pair of purring lovebirds. The public display of Charles's affection nauseated him, and normally he would have turned away from the sight in distaste. But then the maid's pale knuckles twisted at the cloth of her apron, even while she smiled at the prince. A clear sign something was amiss. Given Ferdinand's long experience working with subterfuge and deceit, he was positive she was hiding something she desperately wanted to confess to the prince. Ferdinand frowned. Could it be that she felt guilty working with him, the Grand Duke? No, in the height of romantic love, court intrigue, and the machinations of espionage wouldn't be on the simple peasant girl's mind. It had to be something else. The Duke had always had a strong sense of intuition. It was what had gotten him so far in his position. He had a feeling that whatever the prince and his bride were discussing, it would be useful to hear. He inched closer to the couple, tilting his head to catch what they were saying. "I didn't mean to leave," Cinderella began. "But, well, you see, I didn't have a choice. I had to go because—" Her voice trailed off, and the Duke leaned forward, nearly tripping over his own shoes. "Because of what?" asked Charles. "Yes, because of what?" Ferdinand echoed in his thoughts. "Because of my fairy godmother. It was her magic that helped me to the ball, and she warned that at the stroke of midnight everything would be as it was before." "You have a fairy godmother?" "Fairy godmother!" Confounded by the possibility that magic was involved, Ferdinand knit his thick brows. No, it couldn't be. All magical beings had been banished from Arules years ago. His father had seen to that. Magic had brought chaos to every kingdom it touched. With uncontrolled and uncontrollable fairies casting spells and curses, that magic might have somehow returned to Arules was terrifying news. "Strange," murmured Charles. "I haven't heard anyone talk about magic in a long, long time. I'd almost forgotten about it." Ferdinand crouched, tiptoeing yet closer to the corner of the wall. Fearing he might have misheard the girl, he held his breath. He needed to listen closely to what she said next. "Yes," replied Cinderella, staring nervously at her hands. She looked up at the prince. All of it was magic. The dress, the carriage, the horses, it all vanished. But not the slippers. No, not the slippers. And not you. Not me. A pause. "You see, that's why I was in such a hurry to leave. It sounds silly now, but I didn't want you to know that everything you saw was a spell cast by my fairy godmother. That my carriage was really a pumpkin, the horses really 4 mice, and my gown nothing but rags. I wouldn't have cared. I suppose I was afraid," Cinderella swallowed. "It had been so long since I'd actually talked to someone. I was afraid you wouldn't accept me. I was afraid that if I stayed, I'd care about you too much, and it'd make going back to my old life impossible." Cinderella looked up at the prince, her voice soft. "Do you believe me?" Charles tilted her chin toward him. His expression so tender, Ferdinand wrinkled his nose, repulsed. "Yes, I believe you." Carefully, Ferdinand crouched backward and stood. He had heard all he needed to. Lo and behold, it was sorcery. That explained why his men hadn't been able to find her. Who would have guessed a chase of pumpkin drawn by 4 mice? Ferdinand clenched his fist at his sides, remembering his abject embarrassment when he'd had to report to the king that the maiden has vanished. He hadn't been able to understand it either. How would a young lady in a coach manage to elude dozens of trained guards, then disappear without a trace for days? But now, all the pieces of the puzzle had come together. He had to hand it to the girl. She was charming. The loveliest young lady at the ball, and no wonder with the fairy godmother at her side. Ferdinand grimaced. He would have to proceed very, very carefully. If this Cinderella girl had a magical accomplice, then she was a danger to the kingdom, a threat to all. Even more so because Charles clearly was in love with her. Ferdinand had to tell the king right away, but first he needed to ensure the king would be on his side. These days, now that Charles had returned, that was increasingly unlikely. Well, Ferdinand would take drastic measures to make the king agree, even if that required some magic of his own. A visit to his trusted pharmacist would do just the trick. Chapter 25. At last, Duchess Genevieve retired for her afternoon nap, and Cinderella tiptoed out of the bedchamber and quietly shut the door. Behind her, Bruno nipped at her ankles and let out a low woof. "Her Highness is asleep." She placed a finger on her lips. "Be good now. I'll be back soon." After filling Bruno's water bowl, Cinderella tore off her wig and undid her apron. She needed to freshen up in her chambers before meeting Charles, but attending to the Duchess as well as taking over Amelia's chores had taken all the morning and afternoon. It was already past 4. After bidding goodbye to Bruno, she raced for her quarters. Well, servants weren't exactly permitted to race across the palace, but Cinderella did her best. Her heels clicked at a brisk tempo against the wooden parquet, her steps a steady counterpoint to the unsteady beat of her heart. She hadn't known her heart could dance, but here it was, beating in a maddening rhythm that thrummed in her chest and buzzed in her ears. It didn't slow as she changed in her room. So filled was she with the idea of a fresh start. And as her mind whirled, she realized there was one person she wanted to tell, one whose life could change just as much as hers. "Fairy godmother, Lenore," Cinderella whispered as she looked into her mirror. There was no answer. Perhaps the fairy had borrowed too much magic and could not get to her. Cinderella went on, hoping her godmother could hear her from wherever she was. "All is well now between the prince and me, but I haven't forgotten about you. I'm going to tell Charles about the ban on magic. Once he hears more about the situation, I know he'll confront the Grand Duke and talk to his father about reversing it." Cinderella paused, gently touching the mirror with her fingertips to seal the promise. Then she made her way out of the servants' quarters, ready to meet the prince. She did not know what the afternoon would bring, but she had more hope in her heart than she'd had in a very long time. She was just rounding the hallway at the portress when she heard it, a familiar voice calling her name. "Cinderella! Cinderella!" Startled, Cinderella came to a stop. The gallery was empty. Where was the voice coming from? "Lenora," she whispered, "is that you?" The painting to her right shimmered. It was one she had noticed before, of Genevieve and Arthur, and the voice seemed to be coming from the volume under the Duke of Orleans' arm, with the obscured title, Enchantments. "Yes," she whispered the fairy godmother. Her voice was tremulous and faint. "My child, did you hear me earlier? I have such wonderful news about Charles." She blushed. "I mean, the prince. He knows it was me at the ball, and I think he cares for me. I'll help you. I know it." "Oh, my dear, I know you think you've solved it, but perhaps you need to know more about what happened, why magic is forbidden." Cinderella drew closer. She couldn't see Lenora, but the outline of a pearly white wand glimmered from the spine of the painted book. Her godmother was there. I'm listening. Years ago, when the queen was born, all the high fairies of Arulas blessed her with gifts: beauty, charm, grace, kindness, wit, and lastly, selflessness. As she grew up, she brought joy to everyone who met her, most of all to the king. But there were those who sought to take advantage of her kindness, the Grand Duke's father being one of them. One winter, a terrible fever spread across the kingdom. Out of the goodness of her heart, the queen sent all the royal physicians to look after the people. There weren't enough doctors, so on some days she went too. Then things worsened, and the fever took her. Cinderella drew a sharp breath. Poor Charles. It was a dark time, Lenora continued. The Grand Duke's father took advantage of the king's grief. For years he'd been threatened by the power fairies possessed, by the influence we could have on the court. He took advantage of the growing distrust and fear already rampant in the kingdom against our kind. He blamed us for making the queen too kind and too selfless. He blamed us for making the queen, rallying those who were already rounding up and executing fairies. He hunted the high fairies who had blessed the queen and destroyed their wands. The king, distraught, listened, and he forbade magic in Arulas and banished all fairies, warning that if we ever returned, not only would our wands be broken, we would be imprisoned for life. Her voice deepened. That is why we have been living in exile. Oh, Lenora, Cinderella whispered, I'm sorry. I tell you this only so you are careful, my child, said her godmother. There are those in this castle who are very content with the way things stand, the present Grand Duke being one of them. I have heard that he has taken up his father's causes with gusto. What about the Duke and Duchess of Orleans? Cinderella asked. I found something in the library that I think they wrote to one another years ago about trying to help. Lenora smiled sadly. The Duke of Orleans did his best to fight the ruling, and he lost much of his support in the council doing so. He and the Duchess warned many fairies when the Grand Duke would begin his hunt. The Duchess is back now, said Cinderella. She could help, and the prince. Cinderella couldn't give up the idea that things could be different for all of them. Lenora's voice brightened slightly. The prince's love is what you deserve, my dear, but the Duke will be suspicious of you once he learns of Charles's affections. Even more so if you start talking about magic. Even more so if you start talking about magic. Be happy and keep yourself safe. Do not interfere. But, fairy godmother, The grandfather clock at the end of the hall began to chime, cutting off Cinderella's reply. She glanced back, making sure no one else had entered the hall. They were still alone, but when Cinderella turned back, the painting had gone still. I'm going to help you, she promised. Charles was waiting for her in the glass conservatory before the garden entrance. He started when their gazes met, lurching slightly forward and nearly tripping over his shoes. Cinderella chuckled, and the prince's eyes filled with mirth. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, she began. Her voice trailed as she remembered what Lenora had said about his mother. She wanted to ask him about magic, but Lenora's warning to be careful was fresh on her mind. She'd wait until they were outside of the palace and out of range of the Duke with his ears everywhere. I got a little sidetracked in the gallery. And here I thought Aunt Genevieve was the one keeping you, Charles teased. She did give me a few extra chores, said Cinderella, grateful when he didn't ask if she had told the Duchess yet that she was his intended bride. I don't think she's very happy with me right now. I brought her the wrong type of tea 3 times. She blushed sheepishly. She blushed sheepishly, and as his smile widened, her stomach gave a pleasant flutter. She smiled back at him. I guess my mind was somewhere else. I've become quite familiar with the feeling, confessed Charles, gesturing at his clothes. I might have put this shirt on backwards twice today. You? She said playfully. I assumed you had a valet who dressed you. Maybe 2. Since the day I was born, replied Charles in a serious tone. Really? No, he chuckled. I am quite capable of dressing myself. Sometimes I worry it's the only thing I'll be capable of. Though he tried to hide it, a note of melancholy colored the prince's last words. "You sound worried," said Cinderella softly. "I am," Charles murmured. "So much has changed. It's funny, the thought of one's parents getting old. When we're children, they worry so about us. Now I feel like things have reversed, and soon I'll be expected to take on his responsibilities, and I don't know if I'm ready." Before Cinderella could reply, Charles brightened and gestured at the garden doors. "But we've lingered here long enough. Come, there's so much I want to show you." "Where are the guards?" asked Cinderella. She'd been nervous about coming to this part of the castle, half expecting the guards wouldn't permit her outside. But she hadn't come across a single one. "I dismissed them. As of today, anyone in the palace is welcome to enjoy the gardens." Cinderella's eyes widened. "Do you mean that?" "By royal decree of the crown prince." With a flourish, Charles stepped aside, revealing a new sign he'd posted on the glass door. "By royal command," Cinderella read, "every person in the palace, whether a member of the royal household, a guest of His Majesty the King, or a retainer of the crown, hereby shall be permitted access to the royal gardens." She clasped her hands, mustering her enthusiasm. "It's very nice." But something was still missing, and it showed on her face. "What is it?" asked the prince. "Every person in the palace," she repeated. "Why not anyone in Arules? Or anyone at all?" "Surely not anyone can walk into the palace," said Charles, confused. "Valors don't have a public garden," Cinderella explained. "And the palace. One of the reasons I dreamed of going to the ball was because I spent all my life staring up at it. Opening the gardens would give everyone a glimpse of the palace, of their ruler, even if it was just part of the garden." "You have a point. I'll bring it up with my father. How's that?" Her smile widened, and that was all the response he needed. Taking the prince's outstretched arms, Cinderella stepped through the double doors into the gardens. It was nearly sundown, and a soft glow bathed the flowers. "This way," Charles said, gesturing at a wooden bridge over a pond. "When do you have to be back?" "To the Duchess?" Cinderella repeated. "I hope she doesn't mind me telling you. Her naps are usually an hour long." "Then that's just enough time." "For a surprise," replied the prince, guiding her through a garden of fluted lilies. Across the lilies was a pond. Its water is a vibrant green from reflecting the trees around it. In the center of the pond swam two elegant white birds, their long necks curved towards one another. "Swans," Cinderella breathed. She leaned in against the bridge's rail and gazed at the pair of swans gliding across the pond. At her side, Charles rested his elbows on the bridge. "They're here every evening before sundown. Sometimes during sunset you can see the light dapple their feathers. Look." Rays of golden light stroked the swans' wings, which shimmered against the still waters. "I used to come here whenever I could to watch them," said Prince Charles. "I'm certain it's been the very same pair of swans for years. When I saw them, I'd feel a little less lonely." "How happy they look," mused Cinderella, watching as the swans took flight, their feet skidding across the pond before they soared into the sky, free to come and go as they please. She watched them weave through the clouds until they finally disappeared. "What are you thinking about?" asked the prince. "Once they fall in love, they stay in love forever," Cinderella murmured, repeating what he told her at the masquerade. "My parents had a love like that, always laughing together, telling each other stories, and dancing with me in the middle. My mother was the one who taught me how to waltz and to sing." Cinderella started for one of the trees on the other side of the bridge. There used to be a swing in the family garden, one hanging from a sturdy oak tree just like this one. Mamma would sit on it and sing about the sweet nightingale perching on the branches above her. Sometimes she'd put me on her lap, and my papa would push the two of us toward the sky. When I got older, birds used to sit outside my window too, the same ones every day. I listened to them before starting my chores." "Your chores?" Cinderella faltered. She hadn't meant to bring up that aspect of her past, but she trusted him enough to tell him the truth. "Yes. After my father passed away, my stepmother dismissed the household staff to help make ends meet. Her stepdaughters took my bedroom and my clothes, and I became their servant. She placed her hand on his, anticipating his reaction. It's in the past now. I'm happy, and I'm definitely not lonely anymore. I have Louisa. She's the first friend I've had in years, aside from my dog Bruno and the mice in my stepmother's house, and now I have you. Charles entwined his fingers with hers. My parents didn't have any other children, he mused, and Father was always busy in meetings with the council. I didn't have many friends, but I encountered a few wise professors, and I learned to love my studies. I spent hours every day in the library. Books became my friends because I didn't have real ones. I love reading too, said Cinderella wistfully. My parents used to have a beautiful library. She omitted the fact that her stepmother had sold off many of the books. There would be stories about the countries around us. I'd forgotten most of them until now. It's easy to forget how vast the world is and how little of it I've seen. I've never even been outside the capital. Then I'll bring you, Charles promised. I'll take you all around the world. We'll tour all the neighboring kingdoms together. But I have to warn you, traveling as royalty isn't as grand as it looks. You mean it's not 30 courses at every meal and servants waiting on you hand and foot? Cinderella teased. Not always. Everything is always planned out for you. You don't get to choose where you want to go or what you want to do. But you do get to learn more about the world and see lots of operas and ballets. Cinderella covered her mouth, hiding a laugh. To anyone else, that would sound wonderful, especially the ballet. I haven't been to see one since I was a little girl, but I can't easily do without the 30-course meal and the servants. Prince Charles grimaced. I'm sounding spoiled, aren't I? You grew up being told how to act, what to wear, what to say, where to go, and what to eat. I understand that. It wasn't so different for me. He took her hand. It is silly feeling sorry for a prince, but up until now, I never had a choice in anything. Before I left for school, the only time I left the palace was when I was out with my father on official business. Even when I did go out, I saw only a sliver of Arules. I should have gotten to know my country. I'll have to rule Arules one day, and everything I do will be scrutinized by my council and my people. If there's one freedom I'm determined to have, it's to choose who I love and marry. The warmth in his words made Cinderella's stomach flip. Strange, they'd only been together for a few hours at most, yet how familiar he was becoming to her. She looked into his eyes, suddenly feeling bold. I want to go everywhere with you, whether we get to choose where we go or not. She brightened, an idea hitting her. Louisa and I sneaked away to go to the masquerade. We could dress up as merchants when everyone's sleeping and slip out, she grinned. See the real Arules, as you say? You mean it? Charles asked. When she nodded, he clasped her hands, bringing them to his chest. Let's start tonight. I'll try to get Aunt Genevieve to dismiss you early for the evening. Meet me by the coach house. I have some place I want to bring you. The coach house wasn't far from the stables, which Cinderella often passed on her morning walks with Bruno after she'd brought the Duchess breakfast. She hadn't paid much attention to it before. It was where the royal carriages were kept. There had to be over a dozen carriages, each with gilded trimmings along the doors, fine velvet upholstery, and thick blue flags. She didn't see the prince anywhere, or any attendants. Charles, she called out. No answer. The coach house was empty. Cinderella walked towards the stables, wondering where the prince could be. He told her to wait outside the coach house on the path, but there, at the very end of the road, was a carriage that had none of the royal finishes. It was plain, with faded white paint peeling along the edges and open windows instead of glass panes or curtains. In the driver's seat was a shadowy figure she couldn't make out in the dim lamplight. The wheels grumbled against the gravel path, and the horses nickered. The carriage stopped, and Cinderella gasped. The driver was Charles. Setting down the reins and climbing down from his seat, he looked at her sheepishly, the slightest pink tinge color in his cheeks. A driver's cap covered most of his black hair, and he wore a twill coat that was ever so slightly too boxy and large. But for his face, he was almost unrecognizable. I encouraged everyone to take the evening off, he explained, even though she hadn't asked for an explanation. He seemed nervous, which was oddly comforting. She was nervous too. Don't be silly, she tried to reason with herself. There was nothing to worry about, and he knew who she was, a commoner, a former servant in her stepmother's house, and he didn't care the least. So why was her heart racing? Because she was finally spending time with him, as herself, instead of as the maiden with the glass slippers or the princess with the mask. And also because she still needed to ask him about her fairy godmother, and whether he could help her return to Arules. Unaware of her thoughts, Charles gestured at the carriage. I hope you don't mind. Of course not. He started to open the door for her, but Cinderella shook her head. I'm sitting with you in the driver's seat. It's chilly out, he protested. She grabbed one of the blankets from inside the coach. Then I'll wear this. Gathering the folds of her skirt in her hand, she climbed up in the carriage box, ignoring Charles's extended hand. It's rather high. Are you sure you don't? Cinderella plopped onto the seat and grinned down at him. She held out her hand to him. Do you need help getting up? Returning her grin, the prince took her hand and she helped him up to the driver's box. It was a tight and narrow space made for a single driver and barely large enough to fit them both without their knees grazing one another's and their arms so close they were practically linked. But Cinderella didn't mind. Maybe she hadn't needed the blanket after all. The warmth of his presence next to her was enough to make her cheeks burn. Where are we going? She asked after he prodded the horses to begin moving. It's a surprise. Another surprise? You're spoiling me. Once all of Arules knows who you are, we won't have the luxury of going out. Maybe it won't be so bad. Perhaps, he allowed. But after word spread at school that I was the prince, everyone began asking me for favors for their family or avoiding me. Some of the students even hated me. Hated you? For being the prince? Charles's jaw clenched and he nodded. I don't blame them. Many people think the nobility holds too much power, too much wealth. Things have changed, Cinderella, but not enough. And they won't. Not when men like Ferdinand are in charge. I thought your father was in charge. My father cares deeply for the people and the country, but as he's gotten older, I think he's lost sight of how to rule Arules. Too much time with the royal council listening to men who eat with golden spoons and sleep on goose feather pillows. It was different when my mother was still alive. How so? He loved her dearly, but they didn't always get along. Father has an explosive temper, you see, and he's stubborn as a bull. He and my mother would argue fiercely over how to govern Arules. She wanted him to focus more on the people rather than on pleasing the council. I remember during one argument she called him a child for letting Ferdinand and the council influence his decisions instead of listening to his own heart. I want to be a king who listens to heart. He sighed. There I go, talking about politics when we should be talking about you. I want to hear it, Cinderella said, gazing at the city below them. Thousands of lamplights glittered beneath the hill, twinkling like a constellation of stars. Arules is my home, too. I've spent too many years trapped inside my stepmother's home, not knowing what's been happening around me. Then you will, promised the prince. But tonight is for us. Along the outskirts of Valoris, Charles stopped their coach before an open-air theater. Here we are, he said nervously, tethering the horses to a nearby tree. It's just a rehearsal, but I've heard the dances are even better than the royal ballets. I thought you might like it. I do. Cinderella marveled at the stage, a simple wooden platform surrounded by a crown of oak trees adorned with hundreds of candles. Half a dozen wagons and coaches were scattered across the field, other patrons who'd known about the night's rehearsal. Closer to the stage were benches and makeshift chairs, each seat filled by someone raptly anxious for the ballet to begin. The orchestra was much smaller than the one that had played at the masquerade the night before, but its music sailed on the wind, carrying clear and true to Cinderella's ears. The ballet tonight is Dancing Princess, announced the conductor, before the overture began in earnest. Oh, she breathed. You know the story? You don't? When the prince shook his head, she smiled. It's about 12 princesses who sneak out to dance in a magical fairyland. Their father is so distressed about it, he offers one princess's hand in marriage to anyone who will discover where they go each night. Charles raised an eyebrow. Is anyone able to solve the mystery? You'll have to watch the ballet to find out, Cinderella replied mischievously. It was one of my favorite stories growing up. Not anymore? No. When I was a child, I loved pretending to be a princess in a castle, waiting for some curse to befall me and a handsome prince to break it. But as I got older, the feeling of being trapped was all too real. Her voice drifted. After Mama and Papa died, things changed. I realized that real life isn't a fairy tale. She threaded her arm through his. Sometimes it's for the better. It's funny. I used to pretend to be sick so I wouldn't have to go to the ballet, and when I did go, I'd fall asleep. My mother would laugh to see me going willingly. A flood of warmth radiated inside Cinderella's chest, and she teased, Are you going to fall asleep tonight? I have a wild guess the company will make a difference. He spread a blanket over their laps. Under the moonlight, their hands brushed against each other. Besides, Father's royal box always smelled of stale cedar and politics. Both were very conducive to falling asleep. A gentle breeze tickled Cinderella's nape, and she shivered as she inhaled the fresh air. No stale cedar here, nor the sweet undertone of perfume that usually pervaded the palace. She did catch a whiff of sugared nuts from a vendor close to the stage, and the smell of horsehair, but she didn't mind. Politics doesn't have a smell. Oh, it does. I could never even hear the music because someone was always trying to get my father's ear. Someone like the Grand Duke. It was Ferdinand 90% of the time, admitted the prince. The mention of the Grand Duke made Cinderella's mood somber. She leaned forward, trying to relish in the music of the overture. Something's troubling you, Charles observed. Tell me. She bit her lip, glancing at the costume ballerinas waiting off stage. A few of them were dressed as fairies. Can I ask something of you? You may ask anything of me. My fairy godmother told me that magic was once a part of everyday life here in Arules, but now she and her kind have been banished. I'd like to help her return. Then we shall, Charles promised. I'm supposed to begin attending the council meeting shortly. I will bring it up the first chance I'm able. Warmed by his answer, Cinderella started to reach for his hand, then hesitated. She didn't like the thought of keeping anything from him. My godmother also told me that the king banished her kind because of what happened with your mother. The prince's brow knit with confusion. What happened? You don't know, she said softly. She was sick. Many in the kingdom were. She and father sent me to the countryside that winter so I wouldn't fall ill. She swallowed. My fairy godmother said that your mother ordered all the royal physicians to leave the palace and treat those in need. That she joined them, and when she became ill, it was too late. The Grand Duke blamed her death on the kindness and selflessness that the fairies blessed her with when she was born, and then he convinced your father to exile all fairies from Arules. Charles' jaw tensed. I never knew, he said at last. Every time I asked my father, he would refuse to speak of her. Her death hurt him so much. A couple of ladies sitting a row ahead turned to look at them. Cinderella touched Charles's hand and lowered her voice. I understand if you've changed your mind about wanting to help. No, I haven't. My mother was the kindest person I'd ever met, and there isn't a day that I don't miss her, Charles inhaled a ragged breath. But from everything she ever told me about magic, I know that it doesn't make your choices for you. She would have never wanted my father to banish the fairies. She would never have let him unfairly persecute hundreds based on lies. The prince turned to her. Come with me to the next council meeting. I'll do whatever I must to convince my father to change the law. You can ask your fairy godmother to testify. No, it isn't safe for her. Not with the Grand Duke here. He was helping his father take advantage of yours back then. Surely he wouldn't want things to change now, but I will advocate for her if I can. Why am I not surprised that Ferdinand would have something to do with this? Charles gritted his teeth before giving her a small smile. Don't worry, Cinderella. We'll have a word with him. Cinderella squeezed his hand. Together. Together. Charles clasped her hand over his. The ballet was about to begin. Now I want to tell you something. I promise to show you the world, but I can't promise we'll have many nights like this with just the two of us. No royal guards watching and listening to everything we say and do, she joked, but Charles's face was still sober. I thought about what you said, that Arulas has never had a commoner for a princess. Charles squeezed her hand. You will be the first. Cinderella exhaled. This had also been weighing on her heavily. I don't know the first thing about being a princess. How to walk or talk or... Protocol and etiquette are overrated, Charles interrupted, trying to reassure her. Who cares what fork should be used for asparagus or olives or oysters, or how one addresses a baroness versus a countess? But if that's what worries you, all the rules can be learned. What can't be learned is the happiness your laugh brings to those around you, or the way your eyes dance when you smile. It's no small thing I ask of you, he continued, and I would understand if you changed your mind, or if you need more time. Trying to untangle the emotions and thoughts inside her, Cinderella fell quiet. All this time, what had kept her from readily accepting Charles's proposal? All this time, what had kept her from readily accepting Charles's proposal? Fear that she wouldn't be accepted? Fear that he had fallen in love with the idea of the girl at the ball and not her? Fear that she wasn't ready to make such a life-altering decision, not so soon after finally escaping her stepmother? But perhaps she was ready. If she listened to her strongest emotions bubbling around her heart, they urged her to be happy. Wasn't that what Lenora had taught her? Wasn't that the point of it all? There were so many things they had no control over. The pride, the machinations of others, disease, death. Shouldn't they hold on to happiness when they had it? Already in these past few days, she'd been happier with Charles than she had in years. The answer was simple. I'm ready, she whispered, her stomach fluttering as soon as the words left her. Charles looked at her, the light in his eyes wavering. Then, yes, she spoke over him, I accept. He drew her close, holding both her hands and bringing them to his lips. Wishing this moment could last forever, she leaned against the prince's shoulder. At last she knew. So this was love. Chapter 26. To his dismay, Ferdinand was not invited to dinner. He blamed Genevieve. Brimming with the information that magic had returned to Arules, he waited for the king to return to his chambers. But when the opportunity finally arrived, the guards at the door stopped him from entering. The king is asleep, your grace. He is not to be disturbed. The duke sniffed. I have important, urgent news for his majesty. We were given specific orders, your grace. I'm afraid I cannot let you pass. This is important. Ferdinand wedged himself between the guards, ignoring their protests and attempts to stop him, and barged through into the king's bedchambers. Your Majesty, he cried, drawing the long velvet curtains that bathed the king's bedroom in darkness. He shook George's arm, hovering over him as the king stirred. Sire, I have urgent news. King George rolled over in his bed, then threw a pillow over his head. Ferdinand? Confounded man, I asked not to be disturbed. Go away, and that's an order. But your Majesty, the prince has found the mysterious maiden. At the news, the king shot up on his bed. This is cause for celebration. Quick, You'd better listen to my report first, interrupted the Grand Duke, lighting the candle at the king's bedside. What is it? I don't have all day. It's the girl, said Ferdinand curtly. It appears that your son, the prince, has uncovered her identity, and... He paused for effect. And, repeated the king, from your tone, I'll take it you aren't pleased. Let me guess, she's a baroness. No, a merchant's daughter. A mysterious heiress. She's a servant, Ferdinand said flatly. A servant? George leaned back, stroking his chin. A dry, hacking sound escaped him, and Ferdinand couldn't tell whether it was a laugh or a cough. Now that is unexpected. Ferdinand struggled to conceal his frustration. The king was beginning to sound increasingly like his sister. My question to you, sire, is what do we do about it? The prince is intent on marrying her, but as you know, this cannot be. She's not only a servant, but also an orphan. Why should that matter? Ferdinand threw up his arms. Because the prince plans to ask for your permission to marry her. He has it. Ferdinand's jaw went slack. That was wholly unexpected. But, enough, Ferdinand. You wrote your proclamation yourself, didn't you? King George shoved a copy of it in the Duke's face. Said noble prince will, upon bended knee, beg, request, or if need be, implore said maiden that he be granted her hand in marriage, whereupon should the aforementioned maiden look with favor upon his suit, then shall the happy couple pledge their troth. And in due course, finished Ferdinand, upon the inevitable demise of his most gracious and august majesty the king, succeeded to the throne. And in due course, finished Ferdinand, upon the inevitable demise of his most gracious and august majesty the king, succeeded to the throne, there to rule over all the land as king and queen of our beloved kingdom. The inevitable demise. Ferdinand's thoughts lingered on the phrase, and he recalled how he'd ignored it. It was a standard line, one that normally concluded decrees of such nature. Besides, reports from Dr. Coast have always stated that though George's health was weaker than before, it was in no perilous state. Nothing was amiss. That had been as Ferdinand had wanted it. That had been as Ferdinand had wanted it. But ever since that blasted ball, now the wording snagged Ferdinand's attention. It was he, the Grand Duke, who should rule Arulas upon George's passing, not the prince and his scullery maid. It would have been fine if Charles had the decency to marry one of the foreign princesses Ferdinand had selected, but a maid? And one with a fairy godmother? As always, Ferdinand would have to take matters into his own hands. The king wouldn't understand how dangerous the girl was. He'd have to exaggerate her story, fabricate a background for her. A sorceress. Yes, he would tell the King George that the maid practiced dark magic, that if anything would get His Majesty's attention. When the king wasn't looking, Ferdinand patted one of the side pockets in his trousers, making sure that what he'd tucked inside was still there. Something would be amiss, and soon. A son of mine can't renege on his promises, went on King George. Besides, the ballroom's already decorated for a party. We'll have the wedding tomorrow. No, today. The king's intonation grated on Ferdinand. Patience, he reminded himself. Eliminate the root of the threat. But I haven't finished, he said, waiting to reveal his trump card. What do you mean? If only you'd listened to reason, sire, he lamented. I knew the prince had fallen in love unnaturally quickly. Ferdinand leaned closer to the king's bedside. The mysterious maiden enchanted him, and that is why the poor young man hasn't been able to think straight since he met her. She cast a spell on him. Oh, for heaven's sake, Ferdinand. This has gone on long enough. King George suppressed a cough. I know you dislike the idea of Charles marrying a commoner, but these are modern times. This is hardly enough reason to wake me from my rest. It's true, Your Majesty. I heard it from the girl's lips myself. Ferdinand seized a nearby chair and shifted it close to the king's bed. He lowered his voice. She admitted to having magic. That was why she left the ball so suddenly. The king wasn't listening anymore. Come help me get dressed. Is she in the palace? Have someone fetch her. Listen to me, Your Majesty. You haven't even met the girl. She could be a sorceress? The king let out a shallow laugh. If she's cast a spell over my son, then so be it. She can have him. Sire, don't keep siring me. King George let out another cough and cleared his throat, looking aggravated. She could be practicing dark magic. If she were, you wouldn't bother telling me. She would be in the dungeon by now." This was true, and Ferdinand cursed his luck that the king was in a mood of reason. Regrettably, it meant Ferdinand needed to resort to his backup scheme. "Are you quite well, your majesty?" he asked, putting on his most concerned voice. "Perhaps you should have some tonic for your cough." "Bah! Tonics are useless. Pass me my sleeping draught. Where is it?" "Are you blind, Ferdinand? It's behind you." "On my desk." "Dribble a bit into my tea, just a pinch now. I don't want to fall asleep immediately." Surreptitiously, the Grand Duke turned his back to the king and reached into his pocket for a vial of his own, a little something he'd commissioned from a trusted pharmacist. It was stronger than his past request, far stronger. But the pharmacist hadn't even asked what it was for. Everyone trusted Ferdinand. With good reason, too. Who had helped run Arulas after the Queen had passed, leaving King George overcome with grief? Who had attended every council meeting and kept the court together when the nobles quarreled? Forcing his shaking hand to steady, he slipped a delicate dash of his vial's contents into the king's draught. Then a quick splash of the sleeping draught to mask the bitterness. An invisible thread of guilt tightened around his neck, and he tugged at his collar uncomfortably. Sometimes a bit of unpleasantness was necessary for the good of the kingdom. If this business about His Majesty abdicating soon was true, Ferdinand would have to call upon a secret assembly of his most loyal supporters to propose the amendment to the law that he'd been working on. One that might place him in power, not Prince Charles. He'd have a few days at most. He would have to work quickly. "Here you are, sire." The king poured the mixture down his throat with a grumble. "Despicable stuff, I'll tell you. Couldn't they make this taste better?" "Taste is insignificant if it'll improve your health, sire." "Bah! What do these doctors know? They tell me what I want to hear, that I'll be around to see my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren." George snorted. "Quacks, the lot of them. I'll be lucky if I see the boy married at this point." "You mustn't talk like that, your majesty." "I will talk however I please," the king roared, only to fall into another coughing fit. Once he recovered, he sighed. This kingdom could use a little magic. I could use a little magic. "Your majesty, listen to yourself," pleaded the duke. "Magic has expressly been forbidden. That was my father's recommendation and your law, for good reason, too. Think of how dangerous it can be when wielded by someone with evil intentions." "Yes, but maybe if we hadn't forbidden magic, we wouldn't have to worry about war with our neighbors or within our own country. Charles wouldn't even have to consider marrying a foreign princess." At that, the duke hid a smile. He took out his monocle and pretended to clean it, a habit he was expressly aware he indulged in whenever he needed to deliberate before speaking. He pulled his chair closer to the king's bedside, patiently waiting for his concoction to take effect. "I was listening during the council," said George. "People are angry with me for not making Arulas a fairer place for them to live. A fairer place for them to live. There isn't much I can do for them now, but Charles will right my wrongs." "And I will help him, your majesty." A pause. "If he lets me." The king trusted him, depended on him. If Charles were to rise to the throne soon, the Grand Duke shuddered at the reality of it. He would lose years of hard work and decades of manipulating the king into depending on him for guidance on how to rule Arulas. Ferdinand needed to strategize his next moves very carefully, and he'd begin with the secret assembly of his most trusted men. Prince Charles certainly wouldn't listen to him the way his father did. At first, Ferdinand had resigned himself to the young prince going off to university. Maybe Charles would come back ready to listen to men with far more tact and experience at running the kingdom. But at last, when the prince returned, full of ideas and disdain for Ferdinand, it became evident that things had changed at the Royal University. It had started accepting students based on merit rather than their upbringing, and engaging professors with ideas. Why, he had even heard that Charles had studied under a false identity so he could experience his schooling like a commoner instead of the privileged royal that he is. Ferdinand had suggested to George that his son come home at once when word came that riots near the university had taken place. "Let the boy be a boy," the king had said. "What are they rioting about anyway?" "Taxes," Ferdinand had responded automatically. "Taxes?" the king frowned. "What about? Did we raise them recently?" "No," the duke had lied, when in fact he had authorized a 20% increase in taxes, and during a particularly harsh winter at that. The people had become angry because there was no food. The new taxes were meant to discourage the people from rebelling against the kingdom, but they seemed to have an opposite effect. So, while borrowing the king's royal seal to hide his error, the duke had sent a garrison of troops to quell the rebellion. How relieved he'd been when the entire catastrophe disappeared. Until months later, when the prince, newly returned home after finally completing his studies, brought it up during the council meeting. Charles's conduct had been a terrible surprise. The prince unwilling to listen to reason with logic. The prince unwilling to listen to reason and logic. King George had immediately asked his son to join him in listening to the day's proceedings, but the first thing Charles did was criticize the council's composition. "All of your advisors are lords," the prince had said, lashing out. They're men I vouched for," replied the duke, keeping his temper in check. "Men who have served the council honorably since before you were born. They're men with only their best interest at heart, men who are willing to extort the poor until they have nothing left. I was there during the riots when the new tax was imposed. I'll never forget them." Confusion had etched itself on the king's features. "Ferdinand, you told me we hadn't raised taxes." "Only by an insignificant amount," the Grand Duke blustered. Thank heavens all that moment he remembered the king's plans to throw a ball. Thank heavens at that moment he remembered the king's plans to throw a ball. "Perhaps we should discuss the ball tonight." "The ball?" Charles asked, perplexed. King George's expression brightened. "Yes, my boy, I'm throwing you a ball to celebrate your homecoming. Everyone will be talking about it for years." "That isn't necessary, Father. I'm sure I'll be able to greet everyone at court soon enough. Besides, should we even be throwing lavish parties when there is so much suffering outside the palace?" "Everyone is invited," said the Duke testily. "Not just the gentry." "Everyone?" "Yes, everyone. Every eligible maiden, that was." That had been enough to appease the prince. The Duke had become naive to think that was the end of his troubles with Charles. That perhaps the king had been right. Find a girl for the prince and let him settle down. But no. Then came his calamity of the runaway princess. If only he had been able to identify her earlier so he could send her off somewhere. Then again, perhaps it wasn't too late for that. "Ferdinand," the king was saying, "are you listening to me?" The Duke's head bobbled up. "Of course I am." "I was saying," George said, his nose twitching as he absently held his side, "perhaps we should lift the ban on the magic. Perhaps that was rash, motivated by grief and an attempt to control something we could not. But your majesty, don't you remember what the fairies did? You cannot forgive and forget. The nation will think you're weak and—" "You blamed the fairies, Ferdinand. You and your father. I was never convinced it was their fault. And now I wonder whether it's time to let bygones be bygones." Ferdinand struggled to conceal his shock. Lift the ban on magic and Arules? He couldn't even fathom the chaos that would bring. Trying to hide his dismay, he cleared his throat again loudly. "I'll add it to the list of items to discuss at the next council meeting, sire." "Good. I know I can trust you." The king sniffled, grimacing at what must have been another pang in his side. "It's something I've been thinking about recently, after a long while of not thinking about it." "Perhaps for the best, sire. But now that Genevieve is back, you know, she used to talk my ears off all the time about fairies and such, how she always wanted to meet one. Her husband." "Yes, I remember the Duke of Orleans," Ferdinand cut in. "He was always a proponent of magic." Maybe he had a point. Maybe I was too hasty banishing. Magic does not solve the problems of everyday life, Ferdinand said sensibly. Yes, yes, I know. But sometimes wonder brings happiness. I like to witness something wonderful before I go. He closed his eyes, his head sinking into his pillow. He looks paler and his eyes are sunken in, Ferdinand thought. Your Majesty, are you quite well? Well? Of course I'm well. The king adjusted his sleeping cap to prevent it from falling off his head. I would have been better if you hadn't interrupted my sleep. The moonlight cast a ghostly light upon George's wan skin, and for a moment, seeing the king look so ill, Ferdinand felt a prickle of guilt. Just a tiny prickle. The Duke shrugged it away. Ruling a kingdom required a firm hand. Guilt and regret were for the weak. I thought the news of Charles's runaway princess would be important to you. Ha! Backtracking already, aren't we? You used to be a better liar, Ferdinand. Ferdinand did not reply. It was true. He had been better liar. Now he was simply better at hiding his thoughts. A useful skill cultivated over many years, and one King George had never suspected. Fetch a decree for me, Ferdinand. Which decree, Your Majesty? The Grand Duke tapped the king's shoulders. Your Majesty. George's hooded eyes blinked open. It's inside my desk, third drawer on the right. You'll see it right away. The Duke did as he was told. A crisp piece of parchment slid out of the drawer, and Ferdinand caught sight of the first line, and it was all he needed to see. By royal decree, all magical persons are no longer expelled from Arules. It's already been signed, George. It's already been signed, continued George from the other side of the room. I want you to give it to Charles before the next meeting with the council. Won't you be there? I'll be in the back taking a nap. Another cough. Let it be the first one he presides over. Shouldn't I be the one to preside over the council in your absence? Ferdinand wanted to ask. It had been he who had headed the council meetings for the past 20 years. The prince had only attended a handful, and maybe only one or two when he was actually old enough to understand what was going on. But Ferdinand again, wisely, did not voice his thoughts. He crossed his hands behind his back. I thought I should inform you, sire, your son is planning to hold a third ball this week with the intent of proposing to the sorceress. The king's eyelids drooped, and he began to snore. Did you hear me, sire? What was that? Ah, yes, another ball. Excellent. George wagged a warning finger at the Duke. If you do anything to ruin his chances with the girl, well, you know what will happen. He crossed his arms and tucked himself deeper into his sheets. Now go away. It's in the middle of the night, and I need my rest. The Duke bowed, carefully maintaining his composure. Then I take my leave, Your Majesty. Good night. The king was already snoring, and Ferdinand closed his eyes, envisioning what would happen the next morning. Dr. Coast would arrive just before breakfast, and His Majesty would learn that his illness had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. Ferdinand would be there to comfort him. His Majesty would reason that he should abdicate earlier than expected, and Ferdinand would smoothly convince him that he would aid the prince in ruling Arules. He'd even have the king put it down in writing. Such thoughts soothed his anxious mind as he exited the king's apartments. If things did not go as planned, it could end up disastrous. First, King George didn't seem at all displeased that Charles was planning to wed a servant, and now he wanted to welcome magic back into Arules. Indeed, something had to be done, and Ferdinand had an idea just where to begin. He crumpled the king's decree into his pocket. Then he turned toward the south wing, headed for the servants' quarters. Should there be any threat to the future of Arules, eliminate it immediately, his father had taught him, before it grows. He knew the root of his problem well enough, but eliminate it would be tricky. Very tricky. Ferdinand sniffed. Fortunately, he was up to the challenge. He would find a way to get rid of Cinderella if it was the last thing he did. I'm going to stop there, and I believe there's only going to be one more time that I'll have to read this, and that will conclude So This Is Love. I hope you guys are enjoying it, and wherever you are listening from, I hope you have a blessed morning, evening, night, day, wherever you are. And thanks for jumping on here and listening. I hope you guys have really, really, truly enjoyed this. I'm enjoying reading all the comments that you guys are leaving, and you guys are the best. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to sign off for now, and I'll talk to you on the next one. Bye.